All right, hey everyone, this is the SIG-AUTH meeting for August 31st, 2022. So we're going to be talking a lot about our 126 plans this time around. All right, I guess we'll start with the bugs because I think, Jordan, you moved them to the top, which is probably good. All right, so admission chain. Admission chain is missing the super user, and you have a PR to fix that. Is this PR what we want?
I did a review pass on it. It looks close. Yeah, mostly just wanting to make sure the officer is able to actually pick it back up early in the release. So
I guess two questions. Are we going to backport this once we have it fixed?
Probably so. If it shouldn't be user facing in any way other than fixing the bug. Like there's no compatibility issue outside of this. So if it's a minimal enough fix, then yeah, I would look to backport.
That makes sense to me. I guess the other question I would have is there anything we can do to like make this not happen in the future when somebody wires up an authorizer somewhere else for some reason? You're muted, Jordan. Jordan, you're muted. Can't hear you.
The super user authorizer got set up in a weird place. The direction this pull request is going is re-centralizing it. So I think, like, I don't know how to defend against someone adding code in a new area and us not catching it in review. But at least this would get rid of the split initialization pattern that we have.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, certainly we should fix the bug. I would like it if we somehow made it less likely to happen. But yeah, if certainly having just one way to make an authorizer will be a good starting point. Security will. So would we backport this all the way to 123?
If the fix is minimal enough, yeah, I would probably take it all the way back to 123.
All right. I think you had. Oh, wait. This key encipherment thing, I honestly don't remember what.
This is part 2. The first part merged in 125, which made the controller manager tolerate both types of CSR requests. And so this is the kubelet side, where kubelets that are asking for certificates for elliptic keys don't include the encipherment key usage. So I think this is ready. I just needed to circle back. And
remind me, what's the order you're supposed to upgrade controller manager versus kubelet? Which one comes first?
So kubelet must not be newer than the API server it's talking to. So if you have a 126 kubelet, you must have a 126 API server. Controller manager can be up to one version older. So it either matches or it's one version older. Like you get a leader elected cluster, you have 3, control plane nodes. One might upgrade its API server to 126, but the active controller manager might still be 125. And so that's why we put the change into controller manager in 125 to accept either set of usages. So a 125 controller manager will happily sign a certificate requested by one of these 126 kubelets.
And is that exception just permanent? We're just going to keep it?
That exception. I think from the controller perspective, we'll probably just keep it. Like yeah, we'll assign key usages either way. And going forward, our kubelets will request key usages that make sense.
Okay, but it's okay. So this is not anything we're gonna back.
We're not going to back and forth. No.
Because we can't. It won't work. Okay. All right.
I hesitate to open the SIG-AUTH PR just because it's ugly and I don't want people's eyes to bleed.
Okay.
This is resolving the late breaking issue that we found around SIG-AUTH breaking transport caching in client Go, where if you use the exec plugin, every time you tried to create a transport, it would create a new one. And so if you did like kube control apply on a big manifest, you would end up with a connection to the API server for every item in your manifest. So Mo figured out a clever minimal way to fix the caching safely. So we can backport that, I think, back to 122, which is great. So I think that's about ready to go in.
Yeah, I think you and maybe someone else made some comments this morning, so I'll try to get that.
Antonio, yeah. For the bugs that already have PRs open that are being actively worked on, we don't have to go over them one by one now that now that we've already done that. I mostly wanted to like, I think at the beginning of releases, we should look at our bug backlog and say, like, are there things that we should be fixing before we devote time to new features? So these were ones that I pulled out, but I wanted to give a chance for other people to do the same. Like long-standing issues or correctness issues, we really want to be addressing.
Yeah, so let's see. I think the gRPC thing, I'm just waiting for Wojtek to take another look. I addressed his comments, so that'll be done soon too. So I think that covers the stuff that I guess I would ask the floor. Are there anything else that folks are aware of that we have not captured here that are regressions or bugs or anything that SIG-AUTH owns that we should
actually going back to the Go routine one, Wojtek is out of office for a bit, so let's try to find an alternate reviewer for that.
Did he just go out of office? Like he reviewed this at 11?
No, but he's out of office, so I'm trying really hard not to route things to him.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know that. So yeah, if someone wants to take a look, that'd be great. I think, what's this? I think I touched like a bunch of APIs of crap in the process.
If Antonio's reviewing it, I would probably defer to his review. He did a ton of stuff around shutdown and cleanup and Go routine leakage. So I'm happy with his review if he has already looked at it.
Yeah, Antonio had asked a question about a comment Wojtek had made about which drain or which channel I was using for cleanup, and with grief, I think we've gone a little excessive. Like when you need to draw ASCII art to describe how your server shuts down, I think it's a bit much. But Wojtek made a good comment about that. We probably need to wait until like the whole server's done before terminating KMS stuff, because watches can still be going and you still need to decrypt them. So
okay.
But yeah, this is basic already.
Okay. Did other people have other bugs that have been at the back of your mind? Like, oh yeah, we should look at that. I wanted to give an opportunity for people to bring up things they knew of. Okay. If some occur to you, it's not too late. You can put them here or like shoot an email to the mailing list. Say like, I think this is important and we should do it in 126. And are there any takers, or I'm willing to work on it if you want to volunteer, or you're looking for someone to pair with.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is like, technically we knew about this bug for like months, and then we just didn't realize the cause and the fact that we shouldn't remove core features that then make you use a technically non-functioning feature if you just have enough data. So I'm not sure if there's anything we can do about that, but just if you notice a bug that's not being addressed, sure it has the right SIG labels on it, so that way the right people notice.
Yeah, I think there was one aspect of the SIG-AUTH thing that was reported against the kube control repo as well. So like places where we are tracking issues in multiple repos makes things harder in some ways. I know KubeAtom and kube control have different repos where they track issues. If you see some of those, like make sure people get tagged in, or maybe even spawn an issue in Kubernetes. Like SIG-AUTH doesn't really watch other repos for issues. So
yeah, I did try to make our project board track everything that looked vaguely reasonable for us to track.
okay.
But it's still kind of the adding of items is still semi-manual because I have to run the script on my machine to go parse HTML and stuff.
Okay.
So it's a process. Maybe not a good process. All right, on to features. Who am I? Cap. Yay. Yay, who am I? I have not looked at this. I wanted to look at it, but I don't have to because I know that.
So this one was so close to making it into 125. It missed code freeze by like 3 days, but it was a net new alpha thing, so we didn't feel like pushing for an exception for a brand new alpha thing. So it's basically done. Both David and I had looked at it, and it just needs a rebase. So.
Yep. So this one, I guess there's did this implement any of the kubectl stuff, or is it just the REST API?
Yeah, it adds the alpha kube control who am I command. Okay,
yeah. So I'll try to take a look, but if I don't, I'm not blocking you in any way. Okay. So that one, so that one is, yeah. So this one's on track. All right, where are we at with the token stuff?
That was also pretty close. The implementation pull request had gone through a few rounds of review. Zihang is working on it, and I was reviewing it, so I think it'll probably be ready in the next couple weeks.
Remind me again, what state are we in? Is like, are we, so we're no longer generating them unless you request them explicitly. Is this one trying to clean stuff up?
Yeah, this one is, it's not cleaning stuff up. The first step is tracking usage so we can see which old ones are even being used. So this is saying whenever you use a secret-based auto-generated token, we'll annotate it with the date that it was used. So at most, once a day, it'll be updated. So we have day level granularity on use. And so that's all this is doing. And it'll issue a warning. If you are still using like auto-generated tokens, it'll spit back a warning at you and say, you're using an auto-generated token. If you really want to use secret-based tokens, you should create one, not like scrape an auto-generated one. And so that gives us the building blocks to later optionally clean up auto-generated secret tokens that haven't been used in a certain period of time. I think the proposal in the CAP was a year. Like if you have an auto-generated secret-based token that hasn't been used in a year, that seems like a fair target. for cleanup.
I mean, that's a really long window, but sure, I guess.
Defaults have to be conservative. And if we had started this project 2 years ago, a year would have already passed and we'd be done. So a year goes faster than you expect.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right, cool. So does this need, so you're reviewing, does it need anyone else to take a look or otherwise help you in any way, Jordan?
Like I said, it's already been through a few cycles. I think it's pretty close. So I don't think we need more people on it. If people want to take a look, they're welcome to. But yeah, I don't think we need more folks.
Okay. That's good.
I tried to frame this topic as features that you are planning on working on. So it's not just a, here are things I wish would happen this release. And it's more a, here are things I am planning to devote time to. So we can actually see if we have like implementers and designers and reviewers and people lined up.
Fair. Okay, so I'm going to skip the KMS observability stuff because that was just rolled into KMS v2. So let's see. So KMS v2 has a bunch of stuff. So we probably won't be able to cover it all in sufficient detail, but we can start. So let's see. Is Rom on the line? I'd asked him to join if he was available, but I have now lost the participants list. He's here. I don't see him, so I will try to describe these two things that Rom had opened up. Let me see, did anyone, I asked him also. I'm not sure if this is closed yet, but
just in the interest of time, I don't know that we need to deep dive on each feature. I mostly wanted to make sure we knew who was working on things and which features were sort of being pushed forward. So
okay, let's do this. Let's go through all the stuff and we can come back to some of the details if we have time.
Cool.
Mostly because I need some feedback from folks to like make sure I'm going in the right place. But yeah, so I'm working on KMS v2, Alec is working on it, Anish is working on it, Rita is working on it. So we're good. Lots of people are working on it, which is nice. So that, I think we're good in terms of coverage for people. I plan on keeping it alpha in 126. Mostly because I want more tests. So once 120, basically on the on what we managed to accomplish in 126, we'll determine if in 127 we can get it to a beta state. We'll see. I'm hopeful, but I unlike KMS v1, I will not try to push for a beta until I feel like it's really ready.
Okay.
So we'll come back to some of the details and questions. So there, in the SIG-AUTH kept tracking thing, there's two keps that were, I think one of them was open as an enhancements issued, but didn't make it in for 125. And I don't think the OIDC one has a kep at all. And I wanted to bring these two up because structured OIDC config has come up a few times, and it is listed as one of the keps that someone could try to pick up. And then the same thing for authorization. I don't know why I wrote webhook. It's not just webhook, it's authorization config. Is anyone going to try to pick either one of these things up?
Is that the right link for the multiple authorization webhooks one?
Is it by everyone? Yeah, it looks right. And then this is the kep, right? Yeah. Yeah, so we had decided that it was not ready. And there's open questions on how, like I know David wanted the ability to order the privileged authorizer in some way so he could deny it. I just was skeptical that that would work consistently. So that's an open question there. Even if you pull those bits out, it's still a pretty large cap. So I don't know if anyone is even signed up to actually do the work on this one. So I can take an action item to ping the folks that or the authors and see what their plans are, because you're on the wrong. Or wait, sorry, you're talking about OID's configure authorization. I can ping both of them, but yeah, these need a lot of work early in the 126 cycle if anyone wants them in, because they're both large changes.
Yeah.
Big API surface.
Yeah, I guess I would ask if there's anyone else on the call who has like a vested interest in seeing these make progress, to jump into the PR as well if the author doesn't have bandwidth. Like other people can help take things forward and make progress on them. So it's kind of an open call as well.
I don't think I have anything else on those. Let's see. I have not reviewed this, but I know Nick had pinged me and Mike, I think. Mike, have you taken a look at all? Anything?
I have recently. I think it's pretty close. I think you had the last open comments on it. So
okay,
if you could give it another review and maybe we could get on Slack and discuss it with Nick, we could close it out.
Okay. As context for anyone who does not remember, so this enhancement is to allow, just as we allow a client or credential plugin today to dynamically provide client certificates or tokens to for authentication, this would allow you to dynamically provide a proxy that would then allow the proxy to do whatever it wants, basically. So that proxy would have full control over routing the request to wherever it wants to route it to, and it can arbitrarily modify the request on the way out, and technically could modify the response on the way, and maybe you shouldn't do that one, but you can. So yeah, that's what this cap is about. I think Nick was interested in it for EKS, using it to have, like, I think hardware-based identities for kubelets. That's one. Basically, TLS offload is one, for example, of why you might want to do this. But if anyone's interested in that, I think you get to look at it. That one. All right. Joe, I see you're on the call. What are we talking about?
Yeah, that's the, I don't know if this is the right SIG for it. It's the fine-grained kubelet API authorization. It's split between node and auth, I would presume.
Do you have a link by any chance? I don't think I've heard of this. Okay.
Oh yeah, it's issue 2862. I put a link in the chat. It seemed interesting, so I thought maybe it might be good to have on your radar.
Okay, so I know we had talked some about using cell.
Yeah, this is different than the cell thing. This is just because
okay.
I saw the caps that you were looking at.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I got confused. So does this, I don't think this has a cap though, right?
No, this one doesn't have a cap yet. I just thought since you were listing out things that might be worked on in the next cycle. That might be a good one to have in your list. Should we talk about cell?
Let's see. Let me add this. Yes, we can talk about cell while slightly.
Great. Yeah, so I think we came and talked briefly about cell like a month or month and a half ago, but I think we more focused on what we've been doing up to that point. And I wanted to give a brief overview of what we're thinking about doing in 126, which is starting to integrate cell into admission control. And is it okay if I present?
Yeah, I can try to make you focus.
Flip the bed. No.
Mike, you might have to do it because I'm not a host, so I don't think I can make some.
All right.
So while we wait, the background is in 125. We had added cell as a way to do more advanced validation of CRDs directly into the schemas in 125, and that went to beta. Okay, cool.
You should be good to present.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see if I can get this right tab. There we go.
Joe, I think you muted yourself. Okay, I see your comment, Tim. Tim, do you mind?
I think that's a Zoom bug. So if you were using Zoom Web, you have to share the whole window instead of a tab.
Yeah, that's what happened last time. I remember this. It's just I switched too
otherwise
much
it's
between the threads.
guilty.
All right, so let me share. So instead of sharing, I'll share a window. It should be fine to do. Thanks for waiting, everyone. All right. All right, my audio has not stopped. Awesome. So we're going to try and get this into KEP form probably by the end of the week. If anybody wants, I can share this doc around. We're just collaborating. There's a bunch of people working on this. It's mostly in SIG API machinery. Tim Alclair has been contributing. Max Smythe, who works on OPA Gatekeeper a lot, has been contributing. CC has been contributing. Who's on this call. So the idea is to kind of extend off the work that we did in 125 for CRD validation rules and take that idea to admission control. So instead of having to call out to a webhook to extend admission control, you could do that in process by configuring the API server to know how to do an evaluation of some kind of rule. And that would just be an expression in cell. I won't dig too much into what Excel expression looks like, but you can follow some of the other links in here if you want to know more about that. So I mostly wanted to make sure that this SIG's aware of what we're doing, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I wanted to cover some of the motivations and some of kind of like the goals and see if people have thoughts or concerns, and then we'll start to try and refine this into a real KEP that we can share with everybody. But the very high level idea is that webhooks are complex to develop and they're complex to operate. And so, and what we found is we've gone and we've surveyed a fairly large number of different systems that do webhooks for different kinds of things. We've looked at a lot of policy engines because they seem to kind of be the main missing use case that we need to support. And most of their rules can be expressed very, very with very, very little code. Like it's usually just like an expression or two against the right part of a resource. Like, like you find like the right node in the YAML that you want to check, and you do a check. And most of the rules are really pretty straightforward. So it seems to be a reasonable thing to try and tackle with cell. So that's kind of the experiment we'd like to keep taking further. The main goal is really to kind of reduce the use of webhooks. we've looked at different kinds of use cases, but really policy is the main remaining use case that we think is the focus. CRD validation used to be done with webhooks, but we've already handled that as a special case. So now we're really kind of focusing on policy, which kind of can include some security things. So that's going to be interesting. I think that might apply to SIG-AUTH in a couple different ways. Like you might actually use it to secure something, or you know, how we integrate with information that needs to be secured might also come into play. Some ways I'm thinking about it is that we want to, what we're going to do as an experiment is build a prototype that is actually in a webhook to do what we would eventually do in Tree without a webhook. And we actually want to keep that code around. The idea that we've had is to actually have a supported polyfill. So if you're running a version of Kubernetes that doesn't support this feature yet, or you're running alpha, but you can't use the feature because it's off in alpha, there might be, we want to provide a kind of a supported webhook binary that gives you all this functionality. It probably won't be able to be exactly the same because like the resource group couldn't be exactly what would be the final thing, but it would be very close in functionality. So that's kind of how we're thinking about proving this idea and testing a lot of it out. We also think it's really important that whatever we build allow policies to be reused outside of this one enforcement point. So like admission is a major enforcement point, but a lot of people want to take their policies and apply them at like CI/CD time to make sure like something's sane, or they want to, like when they introduce a new policy, they might also want to audit all the existing objects already in the system to see if they're all adhering or if there's some violations to that policy. So there's kind of a need for portability, which is a little bit more challenging. There are certain rules that you wouldn't be able to do. So like if you had like a time-based rule, like maybe you had a moratorium on releasing or changing stuff in a cluster and you tried to enforce that with the policy rule, you could only do that at like admission enforcement. That wouldn't be like portable to those other cases. So we want to think a little bit about some of those kind of nuances of policy when we build it. The things that we're not trying to do, we're not trying to build a whole policy framework. We're trying to build the extension point at admission control to allow you to build policy engines. And so that's an important distinction, right? Like we're not trying to compete with policy frameworks. We're not trying to take over all of their responsibilities and propose one way of doing it. We're just trying to provide the primitives. So like, it doesn't matter if you're OPA Gatekeeper or Kavano, or you're just doing your own rule set that's small enough that you just do it directly. We don't want to get super involved in all the opinionated things that those systems might take on. I think that's better for the ecosystem to take on. We're not going to do admission support in our first release. We think eventually this is useful, but it's probably too. So like we want to do the equivalent of validating admission webhooks, but not mutating admission webhooks on the first release. But we want to make sure that we don't paint ourselves into any obvious corners when we do that. So we have to kind of keep in mind that we might support mutation in the future, but we're not trying to build that as the first release, if that makes sense. We do want pretty full feature parity with validating admission webhooks, with the exception that like there are going to be certain things that you just wouldn't be able to do. Like when you're running your own binary, you can make a request out to an external system. We're not going to be doing that. You're not going to be running like a long running thing, so you wouldn't be able to like load up an informer and load other objects in or stuff like that. So you're mostly going to be constrained to the object that you can see in the admission request, and maybe some extra information about like the namespace or some other stuff that's really critical. So we're trying to figure out how to balance that. We know that there's a bunch of use cases in policy where people need the labels on the namespace of the object you're admitting. That's really common. There are other more exotic cases where people need to like load up a bunch of other objects in an informer. And that's probably out of scope of this, but maybe the namespace one's in. So that's kind of like how we're thinking about access to other objects. There are some things that policy engines do that are fairly complex compared to what we did in CRD validation. One is that oftentimes a policy engine will separate the declaration of a rule, like somebody will author like some kind of policy rule. Usually that'll be separate from the actual like application of that rule. So like somebody might say, well, this rule applies to this particular namespace and I want to configure it so it's a block list for these particular strings or something. So oftentimes there's a separation between the declaration of policy and kind of the application of it to a cluster. That's one of the things that we're trying to figure out how to support in a reasonable way. It's tricky because it usually means there's additional data that needs to be loaded in. So we've done quite a bit of use case studies around that, and we're going to be like, that's going to probably be one of the more tricky parts of the design, but I wanted to call it out because it's kind of one of the more advanced things. So we have a lot of use cases. We have a lot of capabilities we want to support. I think that's enough to introduce it. Does anybody have any questions?
I was going to ask, have you all considered any approach where, so the context is providing extra data to your functions, to your cell functions. Have you all considered any approach where you could have some like dedicated objects that contain this sort of opaque data that basically, you can imagine somebody running a controller that builds the correct state for their functions and puts it somewhere, and then the contract is, well, you can consume it if you want to.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what a lot of the use cases call for. There's different ideas we've batted around, and I'm like, I haven't convinced myself I have found a winner yet, but like one would be like, you define a CRD for like your configuration information, and then like there's either one CR or a small set of CRs that are this admission capability is able to load up for your policy, and then it uses that. Another one is that like literally the resource that configures policy has a schema declaration and some data right there, and like a controller has to go like figure out what data belongs in there and just jam it into that resource whenever it needs it. And then I think there was a couple other variations of this. All of them have weird pros and cons, so I think this is going to be like a pretty heavy part of the design doc, is like listing out all the different ways that this could be done and trying to see if we can find one that's palatable.
Yeah, I think the most common use I've seen around policies involves at least a slight amount of external state.
Yep.
Which can be internalized by copying the state from external to somewhere that thing can get to. But yeah, I don't know if just the object and like namespace stuff would be enough for a lot of various policy bases.
Yeah, most of them require like a nice little chunk of configuration. In fact, most of them organize the configuration where it's like the policy, the abstract policy isn't actually like kind of a first class object in the system. Like you load those up as like a library of policies, and then like when you actually go to apply one somewhere, that's like the first class object. And so it's kind of inverted in that sense. It's not like you configure the first class object. It's like you load in a library of policies that you're able to use, and then your first class object says which policy it is and then configures it for that application. But that's one of the areas where we're still trying to like figure out what the right thing is to do at the extension point versus what the right thing is to do for the policy engine.
So that reminds. So I saw a comment about PSP. So PSP needs authorization information, or PSP did when they existed.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any plans to expose that to cell functions, the ability to ask the authorizer of the server some questions?
No, I haven't actually thought this through. I would be really interested in understanding that better.
So I'm a bit confused because like an admission request comes with some of the like group memberships, right? And the requesting user. So is that the sort of information you're looking at, or is it more like an RBAC?
It's can the user I just saw do a thing that I believe they need to be able to do to perform the action. So with PSP, it was like, hey, can you use the privileged PSP? yes or no. If you can, then this pot spec is valid because it has a privilege, privilege set to true. Otherwise, it's not valid. That just
Yeah, a current example that maybe we wouldn't consider horribly unusable is the certificate, the CSR, like approving and signing. Like if you go to approve a CSR, in addition to just having write permissions on the endpoint, like the CSR resource in general, you actually need a specific like approve permission on the signer of the signer name represented in the CSR. So that lets me give approved permissions to Alice, but not to approve all CSRs, just to approve CSRs from a specific signer. So that's an example of a kind of thing that we do in validating admission today, that involves like pulling some attribute out of the object and then crafting that into an authorization check.
That's
More
that's
fun.
a
Can you hear
very
me?
good example.
Yeah, now we can.
Great. So I'm not sure this applies to the CSR example, but I think it could apply to the PSP example. What PSP was doing there really was getting a whole bunch of policies, and then and the way it was internally implemented was get all of the policies and then ask, can the user use them? One of the things we've kind of talked about in the context of the cell admission controller is how how dereferencing to other objects would work. So if like I want to get a related object to write a rule on that, like is there some way that we would want to express that? And that's one place that I could see authorization coming into play, where it's like if maybe you use the authenticated user on the admission request to fetch those additional objects. But I'm not sure that we want to actually allow you to fetch additional arbitrary objects in the first place. So I think there's some open questions there.
Yeah, if you're looking for just all kinds of cans of worms to open, looking at the I forget what admission context or controller context or whatever it's called that gets passed to current in process admission plugins, like that has handles to the things that in-tree admission plugins use. And so there's a handle to the authorizer. There's a handle to like get informers, start informers. There's a handle to feature gates, like inspect what features are enabled or disabled. I'm not sure what else. And so like, I think most of the things in that are probably things we would like squint at and say, I don't know if we want to expose like all of that through this API surface, but everything in there is there for a reason, like, because we needed it to do a thing. And so it's at least worth asking, like, should we expose some limited form of that? Or what would we tell people who wanted to write admission that needed this sort of information?
Yeah, I'd like to go at least survey that just to know everything is there.
I mean, and some of this, I think, is more a question of we'll discover new sort of requirements over time, kind of indefinitely, right? So some of this, I think, is around designing something that's flexible enough that you can, like, for instance, write a function that's exposed in cell that checks this authorizer, or thinking about other models that if that's too heavyweight potentially to allow just arbitrary code to be executing, right? There's like a availability risk. Other more lockdown ways of surfacing that functionality. It's
reminds me. We do need to time box this whole discussion because there's more stuff on the agenda. That does remind me though. Does this CAP propose the ability to filter which requests get routed to which cell function based on cell functions?
I don't know if I don't think we committed to using cell functions to define the filtering. Although I think that came up in one of the in one of the strawman designs because it turns out that like knowing which objects to include or send through the is a little bit tricky.
Right. Yeah, it's just a thought. I had asked for similar stuff for in the authorizer config stuff, like the ability to use Cell to filter which requests go to a webhook authorizer, because it's so expensive, because it's run on every single read and write. Yeah, and you know, if you want to have a fail closed authorizer, then you know you're asking for trouble, because it's much more dangerous than admission, because if your reads aren't going to work either.
Yeah.
Can try to share my screen again.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time from the meeting, but we'll have a cap open for this, and I'll try and circulate it so people can dive in more.
Okay, Christoph, you are on the call, sir. So what is going on with Q-Barback proxy?
Yeah, so basically I wanted to say that it's still ongoing. It's not dead, because it's the second attempt to give Q-Barback proxy, turn it over to Kubernetes. So I talked to David, and he mentioned it would be wise to give an update on the progress, like every quarter or something like that. So David, as I mentioned in the last update, did the review. So we are working ourselves through it. There were some nice findings that he had, and there's now a lot of refactoring around the code, because partially the code base is very prototypey, very clever. Some things are not obvious. Some defaults, some implicit defaults, it was not obvious if it is secure or if this is a bug. So now a lot more things are explicit, so we don't rely on any defaults, for example, in the subject access review. And yeah, we have now some bigger refactorings that are pretty big. So we're taking more and more code from Kubernetes and the API server and dropping more of our own code, which has small implications in different behavior, where we kind of tend to create a big V1 release that we could then hand over to Kubernetes. Like a good example would be, for example, the certificates reloader. You could customize, for example, the time, how often it should check if there is a change to the file, and in Kubernetes it's per default 1 minute, once per minute. So there are small changes. Also, we are completely removing the insecure listening and other stuff like that. So yeah, we're kind of preparing for a kind of bigger V1 release, and we will see how we continue from that if we try to support 2 different versions. Yeah, so stuff that we need to figure out. Oh, and there's one big thing left. So David was very concerned about proxies and them being upgrade aware. So he referenced me to a big CVE. So there's also discussion around how to solve that, if we use the solution that's in Kubernetes, or if we use something specific. But I think Mo also posted a test suite that we should run against the server to give it some security, and that's basically it.
Yeah, so that proxy CV that Kubernetes had years ago, you know, some folks had written tests to see if the server was vulnerable or not. So certainly we can run those. I will say the upgrade aware proxy code in the API server is by far one of the most unreadable things I've ever seen. And to this day, I still don't fully understand exactly what it's trying to do. So the last time I wrote a proxy that was trying to proxy things like this, I did not use that one, mostly because I could not tell you what it did. And instead I went a different route that heavily relied on the standard library to do the right thing. So we should look at that. And I think, Jordan, you had some history. I think the reverse proxy stuff in the Go standard library did not originally support upgrade requests, I think.
Yeah.
but it does
Yeah.
now. So maybe we should not have bespoke code that is ununderstandable.
Yeah, when we first implemented this, the standard library did not support it. When it added support, I have vague memories of aspects of what we were doing that still we couldn't shoehorn into using the standard library. I don't know if that gap has closed, and I don't honestly even remember what the gaps were. It might have been around some of the stuff like how we handle redirects, or how we handled like pulling enough of the headers and status code out from the back end to see if there was an error, and then if there was, instead of forwarding the error, just sort of intercepting that and erroring at this proxy layer. Like I cannot remember all the weirdnesses that crept into our proxy implementation.
Yeah.
I know that's a crummy, like I don't even know what we're recommending. Like we're saying we have an upgrade aware proxy. We don't really recommend you use it, but we also don't really recommend that you like not use it and start a second upgrade aware proxy. Like I don't even know what we're recommending you do.
Yeah. So I mean, I had told Christoph to look at the proxy I wrote that didn't use this. Basically, I think there's three choices, right? They do whatever they're currently doing. They do what Kubernetes does with the upstream, the upgrade aware proxy, or they do what I did. I don't know of any other choices.
Like if I were to make a recommendation, it would probably be like, see if the standard library proxy will do what you need and like pass the test scenarios you have. And then like as a sanity check, sort of look at the vulnerabilities we had, or the terrible bugs we had in our upgrade aware proxy, and make sure that the standard library one doesn't have the same vulnerability. Like there are some things in the standard library network and HTTP packages where it's like, oh, you're holding it wrong. You didn't configure this timeout, or you didn't like handle this redirect, or you didn't do this thing or that thing. Like, and so yeah, if I were starting a new project or like bringing in a new thing, I would probably try to use the standard library one and see if it was not vulnerable to the things we've discovered over the years in ours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the input. I will definitely try it in the order. First, I will go through the standard library, see if it works properly. If not, I will go through the code that Mo wrote. And Mo mentioned this to me, but I wanted to be diplomatic and didn't know if it's okay to say the code is hard to read. So
Oh no, it is. I'll say that.
Okay. Yeah, and the third option would be what we have in Kubernetes. But I will really focus on the tests, if they pass, and what kind of leverage they take to have the exploitation, and try to adapt it if our circumstances are different. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph, for continuing that effort. So we only got like 2 minutes left. So I will basically move all of the KMS stuff to next time. The gist I want to get across is, so Ram had opened up these 2 issues. I would like folks to look at them and tell me if those are things that we consider that we should try to handle, basically. And then I would like to get folks' opinion on if we should let you encrypt all of etcd because you want to and you hate yourself or love yourself, depending on which state you think is good. I know what Jordan thinks about this already, but that's fine. On hot reloading of the encryption config, there was I think the open question there is, should that just happen on its own? Like once the feature exists, should it just do that? Or should you have to opt in, or should you have to opt out, or should it be behind a feature flag, whatever? Like technically, if you're not putting wrong encryption configs on your disk, shouldn't matter. But today, since it doesn't matter, technically stuff could break. And then I think the biggest part of KMS is, so I have proposed in some really high level details an API server managed REST API that exposes enough opaque state for an outside controller to do rotation or to help you with storage migration, basically. So I wanted to get folks' opinion on, would we be willing to have that complexity basically entry? And yes, it's sort of the rough idea. The gist of it is just there's a lot of information that the API server knows about itself. And if you can view that information externally for all API servers, then you could use that to drive when you run storage migration, either in some manual way or using the storage version migrator or whatever. But that's kind of the bit I'm kind of looking for feedback on. Does anyone have any closing thoughts?
This is just a general thing. So everyone who's planning on doing things in 126, make sure the tracking issues and keps get dated early. Kept freeze comes early. It's a short cycle anyway, because it's the one just before holidays, but anyway, especially if you have a design that like has a lot of details to pin down.
Cool. All right, we'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Thanks, y'all.